My
One of
name
the
is
most
Cora,
significant,
and I'm allergic to the very air I breathe. Not in a dramatic, poetic way, more like in a, whoops, forgot my mask, and now I'm turning purple while my organs shut down kind of way. You see, in our world, magic particles float around like glitter at a craft store explosion. Everyone breathes them in, gets stronger, shoots fireballs, talks to butterflies, the usual Tuesday activities. Everyone except me, that is. I'm like the one person allergic to chocolate in a world made entirely of cocoa beans. Except instead of a stomachache, I get to experience what it feels like to have my blood boil from the inside out. The first time it happened, I was 3 years old at a family picnic. One minute I was chasing fairy lights, the next I was convulsing on the ground, while my skin turned interesting shades of blue. The healer said I had maybe 6 hours to live. My brothers, who were barely teenagers at the time, spent those 6 hours building the most advanced air filtration system anyone had ever seen, out of spare magical components and pure desperation. "Cora, your brothers are here," Mom called from downstairs. Speak of the devils. My 3 ridiculously overprotective brothers had arrived for their daily "Is Cora still alive?" check-in. William, the eldest at 28 and most paranoid, probably had a new gadget to test my air filtration system. He'd been upgrading my life support systems weekly since that incident when I was 15 and my backup mask failed during a school field trip. I'd nearly died in the magical botanical gardens, and William had responded by building me what was essentially a wearable clean room. Silver, the middle child at 26 with a flair for dramatics, likely brought another prototype mask that looked like high fashion but functioned like a hazmat suit. He was the artistic one, insisting that if I had to wear life-saving equipment, it should at least look fabulous. Last week's model had been covered in crystals that actually enhanced the filtration while making me look like a very exclusive bank robber. And Jeremy, the youngest at 24 but somehow the most violent, probably just wanted to glare menacingly at anyone who looked at me sideways. Jeremy had killed his first person when he was 16, a healer who tried to cure me by forcing magic particles directly into my bloodstream. I'd been in a coma for 3 days, and Jeremy had made sure that particular healer would never practice medicine again. Or breathe. I slipped on my current mask, a sleek number that made me look like a fashionable bank robber, and headed downstairs, checking the small display on my wrist that monitored particle levels in my immediate vicinity. "Little sister," Silver dramatically threw his arms wide, then immediately checked the seal on my mask with practiced efficiency. "How are the particle levels today? Any spikes? Unusual readings? Did you remember to change the filters?" "Oh, you know, still deadly," I replied cheerfully. "But hey, at least I discovered yesterday that I can absorb energy from thunderstorms now. Caught lightning in my bare hands like some kind of weather wizard. Also, I think I figured out how to draw power from people's nightmares, which is either really cool or deeply concerning." William's eye twitched. It always did when I mentioned new powers. "Cora, we've talked about experimenting without proper safety protocols. What if something had gone wrong? What if the energy feedback had overloaded your system? What if?" "Says the man who built me a mountain fortress with a force field," I interrupted. "Pretty sure that wasn't OSHA approved either. Plus, didn't you once test a new mask design by throwing me into a room full of concentrated magical essence to see if I'd survive?" "That was a controlled environment," William protested, "with backup systems and medical staff on standby and a panic room." Jeremy snorted. "OSHA doesn't exist here, genius." My point exactly. We're all just winging it. The truth was, while everyone else got their power from breathing magic particles like some kind of sparkly vitamins, I had to get creative. Over the years, I'd figured out how to draw energy from all sorts of sources. Storms, moonlight, that weird feeling you get when someone's watching you, even really good pizza. Don't ask me how it works. I'm just grateful it does. The process had been trial and error, mostly error. I'd learned I could absorb kinetic energy after accidentally draining the motion from a charging bull and leaving it frozen mid-leap. I could feed off electromagnetic fields after shorting out half the city's power grid during a particularly emotional teenage breakdown. I discovered my ability to absorb thermal energy when I'd accidentally flash frozen an entire lake during a family camping trip. Each new ability had come with its own near-death experience, and each near-death experience had resulted in my brothers upgrading my safety equipment and threatening various people with bodily harm. "Speaking of safety," William said, pulling out what looked like a crystal-powered smartphone crossed with a medical scanner, "we've updated your emergency beacon. Now it sends alerts to all 3 of us, the hospital, the private medical team you keep on retainer, And somehow, Jeremy rigged it to automatically order your favorite takeout and dispatch a tactical response team. Because nothing says medical emergency like lo mein and armed backup, I deadpanned. Hey, you always complain about hospital food, and you never know when you might need covering fire during an evacuation, Jeremy shrugged. Plus, I've got the response team trained in anti-magic combat techniques just in case someone tries to weaponize particles against you. Weaponize? Jeremy, that's terrifyingly specific. I like to be prepared. 3 weeks later, I was at Silver's apartment, helping him organize his ridiculously extensive collection of magical artifacts when she walked in. The apartment itself was a work of art. Silver had enchanted the walls to shift colors based on his mood, and the furniture rearranged itself for optimal comfort and aesthetics. Right now, everything was a soothing blue-green, which meant Silver was relaxed and happy. Until Linda arrived. Linda, Silver's girlfriend and the human equivalent of a paper cut, small, seemingly insignificant, yet somehow always managing to cause discomfort, but somehow incredibly annoying and prone to causing unexpected bleeding. "Oh," she said, looking me up and down with obvious disdain. "You're here. Again." The walls immediately shifted to an uncomfortable orange-red, and I saw Silver tense up beside me. "Hi, Linda. So nice to see you too," I replied with exaggerated sweetness. "Love what you've done with your personality, really bringing out those natural bitter undertones." She narrowed her eyes, and I could see magic particles swirling around her fingertips in agitation. My mask sensors immediately started beeping a warning, and I took a step back. "Silver, why's your sister always hanging around? Doesn't she have friends her own age? Or a job? Or literally anywhere else to be?" "I'm literally 22, I said flatly, "and I do have friends. They're just all busy doing normal people things like breathing freely and not worrying about dying from air exposure." "Cora helps me with inventory," Silver explained, completely missing the tension that was making his walls pulse angry red. "She has an eye for magical signature analysis. Plus, she can handle artifacts that would be dangerous for most people to touch." Linda scoffed. "Right. What can someone who can't even cast a simple light spell possibly know about magical artifacts? I bet she's never even seen real magic up close." Oh, if only she knew. Just last week, I'd accidentally absorbed so much energy from a cursed mirror that I'd levitated Silver's entire kitchen while unconscious. The week before that, I'd drained a possessed statue of all its animating energy and turned it back into regular stone. I was basically a walking magical vacuum cleaner, but our family's #1 rule was simple. Nobody finds out about my allergy, ever. The secret wasn't just about my safety, it was about survival. In a world where magical ability determines social status, worth, and even basic human rights, someone who couldn't tolerate magic particles was considered not just effective, but dangerous. There were whispers of government programs designed to help people like me. Help that usually involved permanent institutionalization. Or worse. "You'd be surprised what you can learn from books," I said mildly, picking up an ancient-looking dagger that was practically humming with power. The moment my fingers touched the hilt, the weapon's energy started flowing into me, making the blade glow brighter and brighter. Linda's eyes widened as the dagger started resonating, its light pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat. I could feel its history, the battles it had seen, the magic it had channeled, the lives it had taken. All of that power was just sitting there, waiting to be absorbed. I quickly set it down before it could start doing anything dramatic like summoning ancient spirits or playing smooth jazz. The last time I'd overfed on magical energy from an artifact, I'd accidentally opened a portal to what Jeremy insisted was definitely not hell, but probably wasn't anywhere nice either. "How did you?" Linda started, her voice sharp with suspicion. "Huh? Good question," I interrupted, grabbing Silver's arm. "Hey, didn't you want to show me that new protection charm you've been working on? The one that's supposed to create a localized particle-free zone?" Silver, bless his oblivious heart, immediately got distracted. "Oh yes, Linda, you should see this. It's revolutionary. If I can perfect the formula, it could help people who are sensitive to high magical concentrations." But Linda was still staring at the spot where I'd been holding the dagger, her expression calculating in a way that made my skin crawl and my mask's threat detection system start chirping warnings. Over the next hour, I noticed Linda asking increasingly specific questions about my background, my health, my family's protective behaviors. Questions that seemed casual, but felt pointed, like verbal scalpels probing for weak spots. "So Cora," she said as we sat down for tea, "you're always wearing that mask. Is it a fashion statement? Or?" "Chronic illness," I replied smoothly, sipping my tea through the mask's feeding tube. Respiratory issues. Very boring medical stuff. What kind of respiratory issues? She pressed. I know some excellent healers. They specialize in magical respiratory disorders. Already tried that route, Silver interjected quickly. Family doctors have it handled. But I could see Linda filing away every detail, every evasion, every protective gesture from Silver. Her eyes were bright with curiosity and something else, something hungry and calculating that made my emergency beacon start warming against my wrist in warning. Over the next few months, Linda developed what I can only describe as a hobby of trying to frame me for various magical disasters, while simultaneously gathering intelligence about my condition. First, she tried to blame me for setting Silver's curtains on fire during a dinner party. She'd even planted evidence, scorch marks that led from my chair to the window. Unfortunately for her, 15 people saw her practicing fire spells in the bathroom beforehand. And William's security cameras, because of course Silver's apartment had security cameras, caught her casting the ignition spell while everyone was distracted by dessert. Then she attempted to pin a flood in the building's lobby on me. This backfired spectacularly when the security footage clearly showed her having a screaming match with a water elemental in the basement, and the magical residue analysis William conducted proved the water bore her signature, not mine. My personal favorite was when she tried to convince everyone that I'd cursed her to only speak in rhymes for a week. Jeremy pointed out that she'd been bragging about learning poetry magic just days before, and when pressed, she couldn't explain how someone who supposedly couldn't use magic could cast a curse that sophisticated. But each failed attempt was accompanied by more probing questions, more careful observations, more detailed notes that I caught her taking when she thought no one was looking. She's not just trying to frame me, I told my brothers during one of our family dinners at the mountain house. The house itself was a masterpiece of protective engineering, built into the mountainside with a dome-shaped force field that kept all magical particles out. Inside, I could breathe freely for the first time each day, removing my mask and feeling like a normal person. She's studying me. Every question, every accusation, every interaction, she's gathering data. She's obsessed with blaming Cora for everything, William observed, his fingers flying over a holographic display showing Linda's activity patterns. But you're right. Look at this. She's been researching magical disabilities, genetic abnormalities, even asking her healer friends about theoretical conditions that might require specialized equipment. I think she's figured out that something's different about me, I said, absently absorbing energy from the fireplace to warm my hands. She knows I'm not just wearing the mask for fashion, and she's smart enough to notice that you three treat me like I'm made of glass. We do not treat you like you're made of glass, Silver protested. Silver, you once threatened to curse an entire restaurant because they seated us too close to a table of battle mages. They were casting enhancement spells. The particle overflow could have been dangerous. You know, now that I think about it, Linda has been asking a lot of really specific questions about you lately, Silver continued, looking troubled. Where you go, what you do, why you always wear that mask, why you never cast spells in public, why our parents built this house, why we're all so protective. My blood ran cold. What kind of questions exactly? She wanted to know about your medical history, if you'd ever been tested for magical deficiencies. Whether you were born normal and something happened, or if you'd always been, different. She asked about the hospital visits, the specialized equipment, even tried to get me to show her the medical records William keeps. She asked me about the emergency protocols, Jeremy added grimly. Wanted to know what constitutes a medical emergency for you. What happens if you're exposed to high magical concentrations? How fast we need to respond. I told her it was none of her business, but she kept pushing. And me, William said. Pulling up another holographic display, she's been researching the companies that built your equipment, trying to trace the specifications. Look at this. She accessed public records about the house construction, building permits, even tried to hack into the medical supply orders. I stared at the evidence spread out before us. She's not just suspicious. She's investigating. But why? What does she gain from exposing me? Money, Jeremy said bluntly. Information like this would be valuable to the right buyer. Or wrong buyer, depending on your perspective. Or she's working for someone, William added. Someone who's specifically looking for people like you. Silver looked stricken. You don't think she's been with me this whole time just to get close to Cora, do you? I think, I said carefully, that we need to assume the worst and hope for the best. And maybe start planning for the possibility that our secret isn't secret anymore. But she kept pushing. William finished grimly. Silver, we need to talk. And by talk, I mean we need to discuss immediate security upgrades and possibly eliminating a threat. We're not killing my girlfriend, Silver protested. Yet, Jeremy added helpfully. What we didn't know was that Linda had already made contact with her buyer, Vincent Blackthorne, vice head of the Magic Bureau and architect of what he called the Purity Initiative. Vincent wasn't just a bureaucrat with delusions of grandeur. He was a methodical monster who had spent the last 5 years systematically hunting down and eliminating anyone who didn't fit his vision of magical perfection. His files, which we'd later discover, contained detailed records of his work. Subject 127, born with inverted magical polarity, terminated via forced particle overdose, body disposed of in Crater Lake. Subject 128, magical abilities inconsistent with genetic markers, disappeared during routine bureau inspection, listed as relocated for specialized treatment. Subject 129, child exhibiting negative magical resonance, parents convinced to surrender custody for advanced therapy. Subject terminated within 24 hours. Parents told child died of complications. Vincent had developed increasingly sophisticated methods over the years. Early on, he'd simply killed his targets and disposed of the bodies. But as he'd gained more power and resources, he'd started covering his tracks with bureaucracy and false documentation. Families were told their defective children had been transferred to specialized facilities. Adults were reported as having moved away for treatment or simply vanishing without explanation. He'd even established a network of research facilities, essentially death camps disguised as medical centers where people with unusual magical conditions were subjected to horrific experiments before being killed. The facilities were funded through black budget allocations and operated under the cover of advancing magical medical science. But Vincent's true genius lay in his ability to make his atrocities look like mercy. He'd convinced dozens of families that their children were suffering and that his treatment would end their pain. He persuaded colleagues that he was doing necessary work to protect society from dangerous magical anomalies. He'd built an entire infrastructure of murder and called it progress. His ultimate goal wasn't just elimination, it was validation. He believed that if he could compile enough evidence of magical defectives and their successful treatment, he could present it to the Bureau's leadership and be promoted to head of the entire organization. He fantasized about implementing his Purity Initiative on a national scale, systematically identifying and eliminating anyone who didn't meet his standards of magical normalcy. And now, Linda had brought him information about the perfect test case. A girl who was not only allergic to magic particles, but was also more powerful than most trained battle mages. I represented everything Vincent hated and feared. Proof that his theories about magical purity were fundamentally wrong. 2 weeks later, I was walking through the market district, enjoying a rare sunny day and the new upgrades William had made to my mask's filtration system, when everything went wrong at once. First, my mask's proximity alarms started screaming warnings about dangerously high particle concentrations. Then, the filtration system made a sad little wheeze and died completely, just as someone activated what felt like a magical particle bomb in the crowd around me. The air became thick as soup with magic particles, far more than occurred naturally. Someone had created an artificial concentration, specifically designed to overwhelm my system. Immediately, the particles started flooding my bloodstream like liquid fire. It felt like breathing molten glass while someone played dubstep in my brain with hammers. My vision blurred, my knees buckled, and I could taste blood as my body began shutting down in stages. I had maybe minutes before organ failure, and that was if I was lucky. Finally, a voice said with obvious satisfaction as strong hands grabbed me from behind. Vincent's going to be so pleased. Do you know how long we've been waiting for the perfect opportunity? I tried to fight back, but without my mask and with particles flooding my system, I was about as threatening as a wet paper towel in a hurricane. They dragged me into a van, and I managed to activate my emergency beacon with fumbling fingers before consciousness started sliding away. As the van drove away, I caught a glimpse of Linda standing at the edge of the market square, counting a thick stack of bills and smiling. I woke up in what appeared to be an abandoned warehouse, because apparently villains shop exclusively at the generic evil hideout store. But this wasn't just any warehouse. As my vision cleared, I realized I was in a nightmare. The walls were lined with glass containers filled with what looked like body parts floating in preservative solution. Labels on the containers read things like Subject 67, defective magical organs, and Subject 102, brain tissue sample, negative magical resonance. My hands were tied, my mask was gone, and every breath felt like swallowing glass shards while my organs burned from the inside. But worse than the physical pain was the smell, death and chemicals, and something else that made my stomach turn. "Ah, you're awake," said a man in an expensive white coat that was splattered with stains I really didn't want to identify. He was standing way too close to a massive magical particle generator that was pumping concentrated magical essence into the air. Just looking at the thing made me nauseous. "I'm Vincent Blackthorne, Vice Head of the Magic Bureau, and you, my dear, are exactly the proof I need to complete my research." "Proof of what?" I croaked, trying not to look at the jars of human remains. "That kidnapping is still illegal? That you have seriously questionable decorating taste?" He smiled coldly, and I noticed his teeth were stained with something dark. "Proof that magical defectives exist, that they're dangerous to society, and that they must be eliminated for the greater good. You see, I've been working for years to create a perfect magical society. No weaklings, no failures, no abominations that threaten the natural order." "No boring monologues?" I interrupted, though my voice was getting weaker. "Because honestly, this is pretty standard villain stuff. Did you get this from a handbook? Evil Schemes for Dummies?" His eye twitched, and he gestured to the specimens lining the walls. "Each of these represents a victory for magical purity. Subject 67 had reversed polarity magic. I studied his organs for weeks before disposal. Subject 102 had negative magical resonance. Fascinating brain chemistry, though ultimately worthless. And now I have you, a perfect specimen of magical allergy combined with impossible power levels." I stared at the jars with growing horror. These weren't just specimens. They were people, children, from the size of some of the containers. Vincent had been murdering families, studying their remains, and calling it research. "You're insane," I whispered. "I'm scientific," he corrected. "Do you know how rare you are? Someone who can't tolerate magical particles, but can somehow wield more power than most battle mages? You're an anomaly that shouldn't exist, and studying your physiology will help me understand how to prevent others like you from being born." "And after you're done studying me?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Vincent gestured to a fresh, empty jar on a nearby shelf, already labeled with my name. "You'll join my collection, naturally. But first, I'm going to document exactly how your body breaks down under magical particle exposure. For science. You won't be making jokes much longer," he continued, adjusting the particle generator to flood the room with even more concentrated magic. "The particles in here will kill you within hours, but slowly enough for me to take detailed notes. I want to understand exactly how your organs fail, in what order, and why." "Hours?" I perked up, despite the situation and the growing realization that I was probably going to end up in one of those jars. "Wow, that's actually longer than usual. Are these like discount particles or something? Because my usual reaction time is more like minutes." Vincent looked confused, which was fair, because most people don't respond to detailed death threats with consumer reviews. What he didn't know was that while the particles were making me feel like I was dying, because I was also slowly absorbing power from his excitement, his anticipation, and the weird sadistic joy radiating from his assistance. It wasn't much, but it was something. More importantly, I was absorbing energy from his particle generator itself. The machine was so overpowered that it was actually leaking the energy I could use. "Tell me," I said, trying to buy time while I slowly gathered power. "How many people have you killed? Ballpark figure." 143 confirmed eliminations, he said proudly. Plus another 67 that were messier. "Children mostly. They don't handle the transition well." "Children," I repeated, feeling something cold and dangerous building in my chest. "You've been murdering children." "I've been preventing them from growing up into threats," he corrected. "Some as young as 5 years old. There was one little girl who could absorb heat energy. Fascinating ability, but clearly dangerous. I had to terminate her before she could reproduce." That's when I realized I wasn't just absorbing energy from the environment. I was absorbing it from my own rage, from the horror and fury building inside me. Vincent had just admitted to murdering a 5-year-old girl whose only crime was being different. "You know what?" I said, my voice getting stronger instead of weaker. "I changed my mind about the monologue. Please, continue. Tell me all about your research." I was still working on slowly building up enough power to break free when the warehouse door didn't just open, it ceased to exist. One moment there was a door, the next there was a Jeremy-shaped hole in the wall, surrounded by twisted metal and what looked like scorch marks. Jeremy walked through the debris like some kind of avenging angel. Except angels probably don't usually carry that many weapons or wear expressions that could curdle milk from 3 blocks away. "Hi, Jeremy," I called out cheerfully, feeling my strength returning as I absorbed energy from his absolutely incandescent rage. "You're right on time. I was just learning about Vincent's hobby of murdering children for science." "You've been missing for 6 hours," he replied. Then turned to Vincent with a smile that was absolutely terrifying. It was the smile he'd worn when he was 16 and had spent 3 days torturing the healer who'd tried to force-feed me magic particles. "You picked the wrong sister." That's when William and Silver made their entrance. William had apparently hacked not just the warehouse's security system, but the entire electrical grid in the area. Every light, every electronic device, every power line was now under his control. The air hummed with electricity, and I could see sparks dancing between his fingers. Silver's entrance was more dramatic. He'd somehow turned the warehouse's entire magical infrastructure against Vincent. Every protective ward, every containment spell, every piece of magical equipment was now resonating in harmony, creating a magical feedback loop that made the building shake. "Gentlemen," I announced to the room at large, my voice carrying clearly now that I'd absorbed enough energy to counteract the particle poisoning. "Meet my brothers. They're a little overprotective. Also, Vincent here has been murdering children and keeping their organs in jars. You should know." The temperature in the room dropped about 20 degrees, and I saw something shift in my brother's expressions. They'd been angry about my kidnapping. Now they were learning about Vincent's true nature, and angry didn't begin to cover it. "Children?" William asked quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous electronic undertone, as every speaker in the building started resonating with his words. 143 confirmed kills, I reported helpfully, plus 67 that were messier. His words, not mine. He seemed particularly proud of murdering a 5-year-old girl who could absorb heat energy. Silver's magical light show stopped abruptly, replaced by something far more dangerous. Concentrated magical energy that began forming geometric patterns in the air around him. Battle magic, the kind they taught in advanced combat classes. Except Silver had always been better at it than the instructors. Jeremy didn't say anything at all. He just started moving. The fight that followed was less of a fight and more of a natural disaster with a grudge and a very specific target. Jeremy moved through Vincent's assistants like they were made of paper, each movement precisely calculated to cause maximum pain without allowing quick death. These weren't random henchmen. As I watched Jeremy work, I realized these were Vincent's research assistants, the people who'd helped him murder children and catalog their remains. Jeremy had apparently reached the same conclusion, because he was taking his time with each one. William had turned the warehouse's ventilation system into a weapon, creating pressure differentials that could crush bones and electrical fields that could stop hearts. But he was being selective, targeting only the people who wore lab coats stained with things that weren't supposed to be on lab coats. Silver was doing something that made all the metal in the building start vibrating ominously. But he was also doing something else, using his magic to preserve evidence. Every document, every specimen jar, every piece of research equipment was being magically sealed and cataloged, even as he systematically destroyed everyone responsible for creating it. Vincent, to his credit, tried to run. He made it about 10 feet before tripping over a conveniently placed magical trap that definitely hadn't been there a minute earlier. "Going somewhere?" I asked, having finally absorbed enough energy to break free from my restraints. I stood up slowly, feeling power flowing through me like electricity through water. We were just getting to the interesting part of the conversation. Vincent scrambled backward, his expensive white coat tearing on the warehouse floor. "You don't understand. I was doing necessary work. Society needs to be protected from people like you." "People like me?" I walked toward him, and with each step, I absorbed more energy from the magical chaos around us. The particle generator he'd been using to torture me was now feeding me power faster than I could process it. "You mean people who are different? People who don't fit your narrow definition of normal?" "Abominations," he screamed. "Genetic mistakes, threats to the natural order." "You know what I think is a threat to the natural order?" I asked, reaching down and grabbing him by the throat. Power flowed through my fingers, and I could feel his life force, his magical energy, everything that made him what he was. "Someone who murders children and calls it science." "Cora," William said quietly. "Don't." "Why not?" I asked, tightening my grip. "He's a child killer, a monster. The world would be better without him." "Because you're not him. Silver said firmly. Because you're better than he is. I stared down at Vincent, feeling the power building in my hands. It would be so easy. Just absorb his life force. Drain every bit of magical energy from his body. Leave him as empty as the children he'd murdered. Instead, I let him go. You're going to trial, I told him as he gasped on the floor. You're going to face the families of every person you killed. You're going to explain to them why their children had to die for your research. No, Vincent whispered. No, they'll never understand. The work was too important. That's when Jeremy appeared behind him like a shadow. Cora's right, Jeremy said pleasantly. You are going to face those families, eventually. But first, you're going to tell us about your network, your facilities, your research sites. You're going to give us everything we need to find and rescue anyone you might have missed. I won't tell you anything. Jeremy's smile widened, and I saw Vincent's eyes go wide with terror. Oh, Vincent, you really don't understand. I've been doing this for years. I know exactly how to make people talk without leaving marks. And for you, for someone who's been murdering children, I'm going to take my time. What followed was 3 days of the most systematic intelligence gathering I'd ever witnessed. Jeremy, it turned out, was very good at his job. Vincent's network of research facilities, funding sources, and collaborators was extensive. 14 facilities across 3 countries, dozens of researchers, and a bureaucratic structure that had been hiding genocide behind medical terminology for years. William worked around the clock to hack into Vincent's systems, while Silver used his connections in the magical community to trace the money and identify the bureaucrats who'd been covering for Vincent's operation. I spent those 3 days in the specialized hospital, recovering from particle poisoning and absorbing energy from every power source they'd let me near. The facilities, when we finally raided them, were worse than the warehouse. Rows of cells containing people who'd been subjected to horrific experiments. Detailed notes about torture disguised as medical procedures, and room after room of specimen jars containing the remains of Vincent's victims. But we also found survivors. 23 people who'd been scheduled for termination but hadn't yet been killed. Children who'd been separated from their families, adults who'd been reported as missing, entire families who'd been disappeared for showing signs of magical abnormality. Each rescue made Vincent's eventual fate more certain. Jeremy had started keeping a list of the families who'd lost someone to Vincent's research. The list was 17 pages long and growing. I want him to face every single one of them, Jeremy told us as we coordinated the final raids on Vincent's facilities. I want them to see what he did to their children, their parents, their siblings. I want them to understand exactly who this monster is and what he took from them. And then? Silver asked. Then they can decide what justice looks like. The annual Magic Bureau conference was exactly as boring as you'd expected from a government event. Right up until we crashed it, with evidence of the largest genocide in recent magical history. Vincent had somehow managed to convince the Bureau that he was still conducting legitimate research, even after his arrest. He'd been released on bail and was scheduled to present his findings on optimizing magical population demographics to the Bureau's leadership. I walked onto the stage during his presentation wearing my best formal mask, one of Silver's designs that looked like an intricate piece of art, while providing military-grade protection. The conference hall fell silent as I approached the podium. "Excuse me," I said, my voice amplified by the microphone Vincent had been using. "But I think there's been a significant error in your speaker's credentials." Vincent went pale when he saw me. "You should be dead." "Yeah, funny story about that," I replied, pulling out the evidence files that William had compiled. Documents, photos, audio recordings, financial records, everything that proved Vincent's true activities. Turns out I'm surprisingly hard to kill. But you know what's even more interesting? These records of all the people you've murdered. East's conference hall erupted into chaos as William's hacked presentation system started displaying Vincent's research files on every screen in the building. Photos of the specimen jars, audio recordings of his confessions, detailed documentation of each facility, financial records showing Bureau funding being diverted to his death camps. "This is fabricated," Vincent shouted. "Lies created by magical defectives to discredit legitimate research." "Really?" I asked, then did something I'd never done in public before. I pulled off my mask. The room fell silent as magic particles immediately started affecting me. My breathing became labored. My hands started shaking, but I stayed standing through sheer spite and the energy I was absorbing from everyone's shock, horror, and growing anger. My name is Cora, I announced to the stunned crowd, my voice carrying clearly despite my deteriorating condition. I'm allergic to magic particles. According to Vincent's research philosophy, I shouldn't exist. But here I am. As I spoke, I could feel my body starting to shut down from particle exposure. But I was also drawing power from the massive magical field in the room and the intense emotions of hundreds of Bureau officials. The combination was intoxicating and terrifying. Vincent Blackthorne has spent 5 years systematically murdering people like me. I continued, gesturing to the evidence still playing on the screens around us. 143 confirmed kills. 67 others that were messier, his words. Many of them children as young as 5 years old. The crowd was getting restless now. Angry murmurs spreading through the hall as they processed what they were seeing. Photos of Vincent's specimen collection, audio recordings of him describing his research methods, financial documents showing Bureau funds being used to build death camps. He convinced families that their children were suffering and needed treatment, I said, my voice getting stronger as I absorbed more energy from their outrage. He told colleagues he was advancing medical science. He built an entire infrastructure of murder and called it the Purity Initiative. Pause. Lies, Vincent screamed from where Jeremy had pinned him to the wall. All lies. She's a dangerous anomaly. Look at her. She can't even survive in normal air. People like her are threats to society. You're right, I said calmly. I am dangerous. Want to see how dangerous? To prove my point, I drew energy from every magical source in the room. The protective wards, the enhancement spells, the communication crystals, even the ambient magic that kept the building's systems running. Vincent lifted 3 feet off the ground without me touching him, and every light in the conference hall started pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat. So, the question is, I continued, suspending Vincent higher while absorbing power from his terror. Do you want to live in a world where people like Vincent eliminate anyone who's different? Or do you want to live in a world where everyone gets to find their own way to be powerful? Bureau Chief Morrison, a stern woman who'd been silent throughout the presentation, finally stood up. Vincent Blackthorne, you are under arrest for mass murder, falsification of government documents, misuse of Bureau resources, and crimes against magical humanity. You can't arrest me, Vincent shouted as Bureau security moved to surround him. I was protecting society. I was advancing our understanding of magical genetics. You were murdering children, Chief Morrison said coldly, and documenting it like a hobby. That's when Jeremy made his dramatic entrance by crashing through the conference hall's main window. Because apparently, doors are for people without a flair for the theatrical. And Silver started his magical light show that turned the entire hall into something resembling a rave crossed with a courtroom. Vincent tried to break free from the security officers, but William had locked down the building's entire system. Every door, every window, every potential escape route was sealed. He made it about 10 feet before Jeremy caught up to him. Going somewhere? Jeremy asked pleasantly. We haven't finished our conversation yet. What happened next wasn't pretty, but it was thorough. Vincent's trial became the most publicized legal proceeding in magical history, not just because of the scope of his crimes, but because of what it revealed about institutional failures at every level of government. The evidence was overwhelming. Vincent had been operating death camps with Bureau funding for 5 years, and no one had questioned where the money was going or why so many defective individuals were disappearing. The bureaucratic machinery that had enabled his genocide was almost as horrifying as the genocide itself. But before the trial could begin, there was the matter of justice for the families. Jeremy had kept his promise. Every family that had lost someone to Vincent's research was given the opportunity to confront him, to see the evidence of what had been done to their loved ones, to understand the scope of his crimes. The confrontations took place over 2 weeks in a special courtroom designed to contain magical outbursts. Family after family faced Vincent, and each encounter left him looking smaller, more broken, more aware of what he'd actually done. Mrs. Chen, whose 7-year-old daughter had been relocated for specialized treatment and never seen again, spent 3 hours showing Vincent photos of what his research had cost her family. Her husband had committed suicide 6 months after their daughter disappeared. Her marriage to her second husband had fallen apart from the grief. She'd spent her life savings trying to find her child. Mr. Rodriguez confronted Vincent about his teenage son, who'd been born with the ability to absorb kinetic energy and had been terminated as a potential threat to public safety. He brought video recordings of his son's birthday parties, school plays, soccer games, A full life cut short by Vincent's paranoia. The Stevenson family lost 3 children in one of Vincent's research accidents, siblings aged 5, 8, and 11 who'd all shown signs of unusual magical development. Vincent's notes described them as excellent test subjects for genetic manipulation studies, and detailed the experiments that had killed them. By the end of the 2 weeks, Vincent was a broken man. Not because of physical torture. Jeremy had been surprisingly restrained, limiting himself to psychological pressure and detailed descriptions of what he'd like to do, but because he'd been forced to confront the reality of his actions. "I was trying to protect society," he whispered during one of the final confrontations. I believed they were dangerous." "You believed wrong," said Sarah Martinez, whose infant son had been killed during one of Vincent's early intervention procedures. "And now my baby is dead because of your beliefs." Vincent's trial lasted 6 months and changed everything about how Magical Society handled genetic diversity. The prosecution, led by a team of the Bureau's best legal minds, systematically dismantled every argument Vincent's defense tried to make. They proved that Vincent had falsified research data to support his theories about magical purity. They demonstrated that his dangerous anomalies were actually people with rare but harmless genetic variations. They showed that his death camps had been designed not for research, but for systematic extermination. Most damaging of all, they revealed that Vincent had known his theories were wrong. His private notes, recovered from his personal computers, showed that he discovered evidence contradicting his beliefs about magical genetics years earlier, but had suppressed the findings because they threatened his vision of a pure magical society. I testified for 3 days, describing not just my own experiences with Vincent, but what I'd learned about the scope of his operations. The courtroom was specially modified with particle filters, so I could appear without my mask, and the visual impact of seeing someone literally allergic to the air around them was powerful. "Vincent Blackthorne told me I was an abomination," I said during my testimony. "He said people like me were threats to the natural order, but I've spent my life helping people, protecting my community, and using my abilities to make the world better." The only threat to the natural order was his belief that anyone different deserved to die. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Vincent was found guilty on all counts. 143 counts of first-degree murder, 67 counts of second-degree murder, multiple counts of kidnapping, torture, falsification of government documents, and the newly created charge of crimes against magical humanity. The sentence was death, to be carried out in the traditional manner, complete magical energy drain, followed by exposure to concentrated particle fields. Essentially, Vincent would experience what he'd put his victims through, but in reverse. Jeremy volunteered to carry out the execution personally. His request was approved unanimously. Vincent's execution was broadcast live across the magical world, not for entertainment, but as a statement. The message was clear. Systematic persecution of genetic minorities would not be tolerated, and those who committed such crimes would face justice. But the real change came in the aftermath. Chief Morrison, working with a coalition of reform-minded Bureau officials, completely restructured how the government handled magical diversity. The Purity Initiative was not just disbanded, but actively reversed. Every policy Vincent had influenced was reviewed and modified. Facilities for people with unusual magical conditions were converted from research centers to support centers. Families who'd lost members to Vincent's genocide received compensation and support services. Most importantly, they created the Department of Alternative Magical Development, with me as its head. "You sure about this?" William asked as I reviewed the paperwork that would officially establish my new position. We were in my new office, a building specifically designed with advanced particle filtration and multiple safety systems. Running a government department is going to be very different from hiding in a mountain fortress. "I'm sure," I replied, signing the documents with a pen that had been enchanted to work with my unusual magical signature. Vincent killed people because he thought they were dangerous anomalies. I'm going to prove that we're just different kinds of normal. The department's mission was simple: provide support, resources, and advocacy for anyone whose magical abilities didn't fit standard patterns. We helped people find alternative power sources, developed new technologies for managing unusual conditions, and most importantly, created a community where being different wasn't a death sentence. Our first case was Maria Santos, a 12-year-old girl who absorbed magical energy from plants and accidentally killed her family's garden every time she had an emotion. Her parents had been desperate, terrified that she'd be reported to the authorities and disappeared like so many others. It's okay, I told Maria during our first meeting, showing her how to channel her plant absorption abilities into a small greenhouse we'd built for training purposes. Different doesn't mean wrong. It just means we need to find new ways to help you be amazing. Within 6 months, we'd helped over 200 people with unusual magical conditions. Some, like Maria, just needed training and support. Others required more extensive assistance, new technologies, specialized living environments, even complete lifestyle changes. But all of them found something they'd never had before, a place where they belonged. What we discovered as we worked was that Vincent's genocide had been even more extensive than we'd realized. He hadn't just been murdering people, he'd been terrorizing entire communities into hiding. There was an entire underground network of people with unusual magical conditions who'd been living in secret for years, too afraid to seek help or reveal themselves to authorities. Families who'd changed their identities after a child showed signs of abnormal development. Adults who'd learned to suppress or hide their abilities to avoid detection. They started coming forward slowly, cautiously, after news of Vincent's execution spread. First a few individuals, then families, then entire communities that have been hiding in remote areas. There are thousands of us, explains Dr. Elena Vasquez, a woman who'd been living under an assumed identity for 15 years after developing the ability to absorb emotional energy from large groups. Vincent's people weren't the only ones hunting us. There were private groups, religious organizations, even family members who thought we were cursed or dangerous. How many? I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. We've identified at least 3,000 people currently in hiding, she said. But that's just the ones we know about. There could be 10 times that number. The scope of the problem was staggering. Vincent's genocide hadn't just targeted individuals. It had terrorized an entire population into hiding. People had been living in constant fear, suppressing their abilities, denying their nature, because they knew that being discovered meant death. We need safe houses, I told my brothers during one of our planning sessions. Places where people can come forward without fear, get evaluated safely, and receive protection while we help them integrate into society. How many safe houses? William asked, already pulling up architectural plans on his holographic displays. All of them, I replied, however many it takes. Setting up a network of safe houses turned out to be more complicated than expected, mostly because we discovered that some of Vincent's supporters were still active. The Purity Initiative might have been officially disbanded, but its ideological supporters hadn't disappeared. They'd just gone underground, forming cells of believers who thought Vincent had been right and that his work should continue. Our first indication came when one of our safe houses was bombed. No one was killed, but the message was clear. Some people didn't want us helping magical anomalies integrate into society. They're organized, Jeremy reported after investigating the bombing. Professional explosives, careful timing to avoid casualties but maximize property damage. This wasn't random vandalism, this was a warning. Warning received, I said grimly. What's our response? I vote for finding them and making them very sorry they tried to intimidate us, Jeremy said, with the kind of smile that made reasonable people check their life insurance policies. Silver suggested. Let's try diplomacy first, Silver suggested. Maybe we can reason with them, show them that people with unusual abilities aren't threats. They bombed a safe house, William interrupted, a building specifically designed to help vulnerable people. I don't think they're interested in reasonable discussion. The attacks escalated over the following weeks, another bombing, this time targeting a family we'd been helping. Threatening letters sent to people who'd come forward for assistance. Even attempts to hack our systems and expose the identities of people we were protecting. But the resistance network had made a critical error. They'd attacked people under Jeremy's protection. I found them, Jeremy announced during one of our security briefings, looking like a cat who'd just spotted a particularly interesting mouse. 12 active cells, about 60 people total. They call themselves the Purity Preservation Society. Catchy name, I said dryly, very subtle. They've been meeting in abandoned bureau facilities that Vincent used to control, Jeremy continued. They're led by some of Vincent's former research assistants who avoided prosecution by claiming they were just following orders. The ones who helped him murder children? Silver asked, his usual cheerful demeanor notably absent. The very same. Apparently they think Vincent was a martyr and that his work should continue. They've been planning to restart the elimination programs, starting with the people we've been helping. I felt something cold and dangerous building in my chest. These weren't just ideological opponents. These were the people who'd helped Vincent commit genocide, and now they wanted to finish what he'd started. "What's the plan?" I asked. Jeremy's smile widened. "I thought you'd never ask." What followed was the most systematic dismantling of a terrorist organization I'd ever witnessed. Jeremy, it turned out, had spent the years since Vincent's execution preparing for exactly this scenario. He'd been tracking Vincent's former associates, monitoring their communications, mapping their networks, and identifying their resources. When they finally revealed themselves by attacking our safe houses, he was ready. The beauty of hunting fanatics, Jeremy explained as we reviewed his intelligence files, is that they're predictable. They think they're righteous, so they follow patterns. They think they're smart, so they underestimate opposition. And they think they're justified, so they document everything for posterity. The Purity Preservation Society had indeed been documenting their activities, apparently believing that future generations would thank them for continuing Vincent's work. Their files contained detailed plans for restarting the elimination programs, lists of targets, including my entire family, and even architectural drawings for new research facilities. They were going to start with the children, William reported, his voice tight with controlled anger. Kids like Maria Santos, people who've come to us for help. They had a list of 47 targets under the age of 18. Not anymore, they don't, Jeremy said grimly. The operation took 3 weeks and was carried out with surgical precision. Jeremy had recruited a team of specialists, people whose families had been victims of Vincent's genocide and who had very personal reasons for wanting to prevent its continuation. Each cell was neutralized simultaneously to prevent warnings from being passed between groups. The former research assistants who'd been leading the organization were captured alive for interrogation, while their followers were given a choice: abandon their activities permanently or face the same fate as their leaders. Most chose to abandon their activities. The interrogations revealed the full scope of the continuing threat. The Purity Preservation Society had been just one of several groups trying to continue Vincent's work. There were others, some focused on political action, others on direct violence, and a few that were apparently trying to develop new and more efficient methods of eliminating magical anomalies. "It's like a hydra," I said as we reviewed the intelligence Jeremy's team had gathered. "Cut off one head and 2 more appear." "Then we keep cutting off heads until there are none left," Jeremy replied matter-of-factly. "That could take years. Then it takes years. These people want to murder children because they're different. I have very strong feelings about people who want to murder children." The discovery of multiple terrorist organizations targeting people with unusual magical abilities forced us to make a difficult decision: go public with everything. Up until that point, we'd been working quietly, helping people integrate into society without drawing too much attention to the scope of the problem. But the terrorist attacks made it clear that secrecy wasn't protecting anyone. It was just making it easier for our enemies to operate. "We need to tell people what's really happening," I said during a family meeting at the mountain house. "About Vincent's genocide, about the people still hiding, about the terrorist groups trying to finish what he started." "That's going to make you a target," William pointed out. "Right now, most people don't know who you are or what you represent. Once you go public as the face of magical diversity advocacy, every fanatic with a grievance is going to come after you." "They're already coming after me," I replied. "At least this way, they'll have to do it in the open, where people can see what they really are." The decision to go public started with a series of interviews with major magical news networks. I appeared without my mask for the first time on live television, demonstrating both my vulnerability to magic particles and my ability to wield power that most trained mages couldn't match. The response was immediate and divided. Supporters praised the courage of people who'd been living in hiding and called for government action to protect magical minorities. Opponents claimed that people like me were dangerous anomalies who shouldn't be allowed to exist in civilized society. But the interviews had an unexpected effect. They gave permission for others to come forward. Within a week of the first interview, we were contacted by over 1,000 people who'd been hiding their unusual abilities. Within a month, that number had grown to 10,000. People who'd been living in fear for years, sometimes decades, finally felt safe enough to seek help. The stories were heartbreaking. Families who'd been split apart when children showed signs of abnormal development. Adults who'd spent their lives suppressing their abilities to avoid detection. Entire communities that had developed elaborate systems for hiding their differences from the outside world. But they were also inspiring. People who'd found creative ways to use their unusual abilities to help others. Families who'd stuck together despite the risks. Communities that had built support networks for their most vulnerable members. "We're not anomalies," I said during one particularly memorable interview. We're just people whose abilities don't fit the standard categories. The problem isn't that we're different. The problem is that society hasn't learned how to accommodate difference. The publicity campaign led to congressional hearings on magical diversity and government policy. For 3 weeks, I testified before joint committees of magical and non-magical legislators, explaining the scope of Vincent's genocide and the ongoing needs of magical minority communities. The hearings were contentious. Some legislators were genuinely horrified by what they learned about Vincent's activities and wanted to take immediate action to prevent future genocides. Others questioned whether people with unusual magical abilities were actually deserving of protection, or whether they might indeed represent threats to public safety. "Miss Cora," said Representative Harrison, a man who'd made his political career out of fear-mongering about magical threats, "you claim that people with unusual abilities are harmless. But isn't it true that your own abilities are potentially dangerous? Couldn't someone with your power levels pose a significant risk to public safety?" "Absolutely," I replied without hesitation. "I could probably level this building if I really wanted to. But so could most of the battle mages in the military, most of the defensive specialists who protect government buildings, and frankly, most of the people sitting on this committee. The question isn't whether powerful people could be dangerous. It's whether we judge people by their potential for harm or by their actual actions." Pause. "But people with standard magical abilities are trained and regulated," Representative Harrison pressed. "They're part of established systems with oversight and accountability. How do we regulate people whose abilities we don't understand?" Pause. "The same way you regulate anyone else," I said. "You focus on behavior, not biology. Vincent Blackthorne had completely standard magical abilities, and he used them to commit genocide. I have unusual abilities, and I use them to help people find housing and medical care. Which one of us was actually dangerous to society?" The hearings eventually led to the passage of the Magical Diversity Protection Act, which established legal protections for people with unusual magical abilities and created funding for support services. It wasn't perfect. There were compromises and loopholes that weakened some of the protections, but it was a start. More importantly, it established the principle that magical diversity was not inherently dangerous and that government had a responsibility to protect all its citizens, regardless of their genetic variations. One of the most significant outcomes of the hearings was funding for specialized educational programs for children with unusual magical abilities. Traditional magical schools weren't equipped to handle students whose powers didn't fit standard categories, and many children were being excluded from education entirely. "We need a school," I told my brothers as we reviewed the education funding that had been allocated. "Not just a support program or a treatment center, a real school where kids can learn to use their abilities safely and effectively." "How many kids are we talking about?" William asked, already pulling up demographic projections. "Based on our current data, probably about 500 children nationwide who could benefit from specialized education," I replied. "But that number's going to grow as more families come forward." The school we built was unlike anything that had existed before. Instead of traditional classrooms focused on standard magical disciplines, we created adaptive learning environments that could be customized for each student's unique abilities and needs. Maria Santos, the girl who absorbed energy from plants, learned to channel her abilities into agricultural magic that could enhance crop growth and soil health. Tommy Chen, who could absorb kinetic energy, developed techniques for defensive magic that could stop projectiles and deflect attacks. Sarah Rodriguez, who could see magical auras, became incredibly skilled at diagnostic magic and magical equipment repair. The key, I explained to a group of visiting educators, is not trying to force unusual abilities into standard categories, but helping students understand what their abilities can do and how to use them effectively. The school also served another important function. It gave children with unusual abilities the chance to interact with others like them. Many of our students had spent their entire lives feeling isolated and different. At the school, they found community. "I never met anyone else who could do what I do," said Alex Martinez, a 14-year-old who could absorb emotional energy from groups of people. "I thought I was broken. Now I know I'm just different, and different can be pretty amazing." Word of our success in protecting and supporting people with unusual magical abilities spread beyond our borders, and we started receiving requests for assistance from other countries. It turned out that Vincent's ideology hadn't been unique to our nation. Similar programs of elimination and persecution were operating in countries around the world, often with government support or at least government indifference. We've identified systematic persecution in at least 12 countries, reported Dr. Elena Vasquez, who'd become our international liaison. Some are more organized than others, but the pattern is consistent. People with unusual abilities are being targeted for elimination or forced into hiding. The international situation was complicated by the fact that different countries had very different approaches to magical governance. Some had democratic systems similar to ours, where reform was possible through legal and political channels. Others had authoritarian regimes where magical ability was strictly controlled and deviation from norms was harshly punished. So, we can't invade other countries to rescue their magical minorities, William pointed out during one of our planning sessions. That would cause international incidents and probably make things worse for the people we're trying to help. But we can provide support for resistance movements, Jeremy suggested. Intelligence, resources, training, help people help themselves. And refugee services, Silver added. Safe passage for people who need to escape persecution. Temporary housing while they get established. Help with integration into our society. P. The refugee program became one of our most important initiatives. We established safe corridors for people fleeing persecution, temporary housing facilities, and integration services that helped refugees adapt to life in a society where their abilities were protected rather than persecuted. The stories of the refugees were both heartbreaking and inspiring. Families who'd walked hundreds of miles to escape governments that wanted to eliminate their children. Adults who'd left everything behind rather than suppress their abilities. Children who'd never known what it felt like to use their powers without fear. But they also brought skills and perspectives that enriched our community, Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a refugee from a country where emotional empaths were considered dangerous, became one of our most effective therapists, helping other refugees process trauma and adjust to their new lives. Miguel Santos, who'd fled after his ability to communicate with animals was deemed unnatural by his government, established a program that used animal-assisted therapy to help children with unusual abilities build confidence. 5 years after Vincent's execution, I was sitting in my office reviewing the annual report on magical diversity programs when Silver knocked on my door. "How's the world changing going?" he asked, settling into one of the comfortable chairs I kept for visitors. "Pretty good," I replied, gesturing to the report. "We've helped over 50,000 people with unusual abilities integrate into society. The school has expanded to 4 campuses. The refugee program has resettled about 3,000 people. And we've only had to ask Jeremy to eliminate 12 terrorist organizations." "Only 12? Silver raised an eyebrow. "He's getting soft in his old age." "He prefers surgically precise to soft," I corrected. "Plus, most of the remaining extremist groups have gotten the message that targeting people under our protection is a very bad idea." "Speaking of Jeremy, where is he?" Silver asked. "Probably teaching our new security recruits advanced interrogation techniques," I said fondly. "Or possibly committing war crimes in the name of child protection. It's hard to tell with Jeremy." Through my office window, I could see the courtyard of our main facility where people with all kinds of unusual abilities were going about their daily lives. Children playing games that involved manipulating gravity and absorbing sunlight. Adults attending support groups for people adjusting to life without secrecy. Families who'd been separated by persecution, finally reunited. "You know," I said to Silver, "I never thought I'd say this, but being allergic to magic was the best thing that ever happened to me." "Really?" Silver asked, skeptically. "Even after all the nearly dying and the kidnapping and the terrorist attacks?" "Especially after all of that," I replied. "Being different taught me that normal is overrated. Being persecuted taught me that everyone deserves protection. And being underestimated taught me that the most dangerous thing you can do is assume someone is helpless just because they don't fit your expectations. Plus, you have the coolest office in the government," Silver pointed out. "That too. Did I mention the office comes with its own particle filtration system, a panic room, and a direct line to Jeremy's tactical response team?" "We may have gone a little overboard with the security features," Silver admitted. "A little?" I raised an eyebrow. "William installed a moat with sharks, magical sharks that can teleport." "It's a decorative water feature with defensive capabilities," he protested. "The sharks have frickin' laser beams, Silver." Jeremy insisted on the laser beams. I shook my head, but I was smiling. My brothers might be completely insane, but they were my completely insane brothers, and I wouldn't trade them for all the breathable air in the world. Besides, someone had to keep Jeremy from starting an international incident, and apparently, that someone was me. Just another day in the life of the magically allergic superhero with 3 criminally overprotective brothers who'd somehow ended up running a government department dedicated to proving that being different wasn't the same as being dangerous. At least it's never boring. And every morning when I put on my mask and head to work, I remember Vincent's words. You're an anomaly that shouldn't exist. He was right about one thing. I probably shouldn't exist, according to the natural laws of magical genetics. But I do exist. We all do. And that's the most beautiful anomaly of all.